As many of you know, I made this channel to scrutinize all kinds of stories. Stories in games that almost exclusively tell a story and do little on the gameplay side, and stories in games that use their gameplay mechanics to help make a story connect with the audience. So it would put me on pretty shaky footing if I was to suggest that there could be such a thing as an objectively bad story in a game. I also realized there's a good case to be made for the fact that stories are neither necessary nor sufficient in making a game good, so I'd be on even more shaky ground if I was about to argue that a bad story can ruin an otherwise satisfactory game. It's not lost on me how this appears. I realize it sounds like I'm making a video demanding creators of this sequel go back and rewrite it so it's more to my liking, basically Kathy Bates' character from Misery. And I have to admit, after playing Mass Effect Andromeda, I gained a lot more sympathy for her character.
It's for the best.
Hey, please!
You heard me. Mass Effect and BioWare games in general didn't get a reputation for telling good stories by accident. They were known for it because they had methods that took advantage of the medium so that their stories would better resonate with audiences. But these methods that made the trilogy so great are ignored in Andromeda. The end result is a situation like if Grand Theft Auto 6 released, but you don't get to steal cars and cause chaos, instead you have to work a day job and stop at every red light. In that situation, the devs would be completely ignoring or missing the point on what made the game so great in the first place, and that's the same concept we see in Andromeda. Except in Andromeda, the things that make the trilogy so great are a bit harder to articulate. That's what this two-part video series is going to examine. In this first video, we're going to see how the trilogy had a formula for getting players engaged in the story in a way that's unique to Mass Effect. And somehow miraculously, that formula was disregarded in Andromeda. And then in the next video, we're going to look at how the writers didn't only omit the message that inspired Mass Effect, they outright contradict it. So fire up that grill that Kathy Bates used to burn that author's manuscript, because I'm feeling inspired. Now, Mass Effect's story was told through the traditional storytelling tools, audio logs, codex entries, and the occasional cutscene, but primarily the game is known for telling its story through its characters, particularly in Mass Effect 2. This is something that Mac Walters, the game's creative director, as well as writer for Mass Effect 1 and head writer of Mass Effect 2 and 3 is well aware of.
You know, I think a lot of the team remembers the characters and the character moments. It's the characters that people love. It's the characters that people remember. And they have to be caught up in something special and interesting, but that's really where it needs to start, rather than being too concerned about, oh, is this plot, as exciting as the last plot, or is this story going to be as epic as the last story? It's like, well, let's actually start with characters.
Now, I think some people believe that Walters said this cynically, to talk people into buying the game, in the hopes they'll relive the great experiences they used to have with the characters, knowing full well that Andromeda wouldn't offer players that same experience. But I don't think that's what happened here. I believe that Walters had every intention of making Andromeda have the fleshed out characters the trilogy had. I believe he understands that the characters are the key to Mass Effect storytelling. I believe he believed what he had were fully fleshed out characters in Andromeda, but I don't believe he accomplished his goal.
Nowadays, we've got a Asari that we've seen so far, and we now know her name is PB, but she was just a smiling Asari. But she already had, a persona with our fans, just based off of her animations and the way she looked.
That which made the characters so rich and authentic in the past games was ejected without much of a plan to replace what was removed. And we can start by examining the character with whom the audience spent most of their time. Ryder. It should be said that Walters had good intentions when fiddling with the delicate system that made the main character so strong in the trilogy. He's on record saying he wanted to replace the Renegade Paragon system with a system that allows for different ways for the Ryder characters to, quote, express themselves, in order to get back to an old-school role-playing tradition. Walters' main point of contention with this system is when he says that it had players automatically picking the path they were going to choose without thinking about it. And we're all familiar with games that wasted their morality systems by making them tied to the power-up system or some other essential mechanic. These games have a system that encourage exactly what Walters describes. But I think Walters is conflating these morality systems with the one in Mass Effect. While this might have been how some players interacted with the trilogy, it wasn't designed to have players play in this way because it wasn't as strict as other games. Instead of an unforgiving system where players were punished if they weren't consistent, Mass Effect had a buffer that allows players to waver if they deem it necessary. So if you were playing Paragon, you could choose the Renegade option if you wanted to be short with squad mates or let your true feelings be known about how obtuse one of the alien races was being.
Because it's a big, stupid jellyfish.
And if you were playing Renegade, you could roleplay as someone who was a no-nonsense character who also had a special place in his heart for some of the NPCs. Sure, you still had to slant towards Renegade or Paragon, but that's a good thing. It means players would feel more conscious of the decisions they've made and are about to make, and that translates to roleplaying. Players now have a feeling that they might not have built up enough social capital to get the red or blue option on the dialogue wheel when it comes to a choice that's important to them. And so it makes players socially aware of their actions in a virtual space. This mechanic made players think about their reputation just like they do in their day-to-day lives, where social pressures demand they act in such a way or else risk losing options later down the road. This is all to say that the Renegade Paragon mechanic constraining a player's reaction has a purpose: to better immerse the player in the world by making them aware of their social presence. And there's another design choice in Mass Effect games that made it clear it was encouraging player interactivity over encouraging players defaulting to Renegade or Paragon. The fact that players knew in what way their choices had an immediate impact on the story, and not a simple option that says Renegade or Paragon. Now I realize this sounds tongue-in-cheek, and that's because it is. Giving players an understanding of the consequences of their actions has the outcome of having players meditate on their choices and consider how those choices are going to impact the story down the road. And it's these moments that made Mass Effect great. In them, players were weighing how they perceived their own morality, what they wanted to see happen next in the story, and how they thought other characters may perceive them based on that choice later in the game. It served to make players thoughtful of their presence and role in this virtual world, and that also meant players felt troubled by the same moral dilemmas Shepard felt troubled by. It's the same kind of engagement most writers hope to evoke from their audience, to make players feel the same kind of internal conflict the protagonist is aware of, and to make them considerate of their actions, just as the protagonist would be. In a poll I did on Twitter, this seems to be how most people did play. I asked how players play games if given moral choice. The second most popular response was to play as a good character, and the most popular was for players to respond to moral choices as they would in real life. But there's more value to a dialogue system based on morality than just immersing players by making them conscious of their social presence. There's a reason games frequently ask players to inject their morality into a game. It's the core of our identities. We base beliefs off these beliefs, and we base other beliefs off those beliefs. This is the reason why you could categorize many of Mass Effect's moral choices into familiar territory. The details might be different, but they can be recognized when we frame them as questions regarding second chances versus risks to society.
You have the power to free us, or return our people to the silence of memory.
Loyalty to the truth versus loyalty to a friend.
You're my captain in this hearing, Shepard. It's your decision. But please, don't destroy what my father was.
And as we're going to see in more detail in the second section, freedom for individuals to choose their own path, even if that likely means certain death, versus submitting to control to survive. This is how Mass Effect still has a protagonist who still has their own lines.
Is this some kind of game? Are you calling in a report just so you can cut us off again?
You know it.
But still has players feeling like they could see their influence in Shepard. Shepard may reach that moral conclusion differently, but we still define Shepard's moral identity by crafting it in the image of our own. It's not a perfect system, and there might be some validity to Walters' criticism of the Paragon Renegade system. After all, even my own poll reveals not all players played this way, so there might be a better way of doing it. But the solution to have Ryder agree and disagree is not a good one. It's simply taking a flawed system and replacing it with a bad one. Once the Paragon Renegade system is ejected from Andromeda, we feel its absence. Because as we're going to see, instead of a character we see as an extension of our moral character, Walters' new system has the unintended effect of adding a layer of separation between the player and the protagonist. Too frequently our only choices are to have Ryder offer superficial platitudes like he or she is trying to continue awkward small talk. Do you know the functional difference between the lines "now we're building again" and "this is vital to our progress"? I don't. This shallow veneer of role-playing mechanics on top of a linear game is an outright deception that appears to humor the fans of the series rather than give them meaningful choice. The result is a game that doesn't have players making meaningful choices, but rather players telling their character how to react to everyone else around them making meaningful choices.
Respectfully, this time you need my help.
Respectfully, the Angara don't need anything from you. We take care of our own.
With the processing power of my AI, I can guarantee the shield breach.
It was risky to be honest about your AI, and honesty makes you different from the cat.
One of the most offensive examples is in PB's loyalty mission, where she kidnaps you, almost kills you in a crash landing, and strands you on a planet with no escape plan. And then they present to you this choice.
So, are you mad, Ryder?
Well, I'm mad. If players were told this is going to be a linear version of Mass Effect that ditched the old system and now Ryder follows orders from the Nexus and the whims of his or her colleagues, I doubt players would have expected a true Mass Effect experience. After all, that's how the original game was advertised.
Many decisions lie ahead. None of them easy.
And this experience is what Mac Walters promised would remain intact.
Look, I'm not going to let this not feel like Mass Effect. You know, I was there, and there's other people on this team who are there, and we can look to those people and say, can you help guide us and make sure we don't go off the rails?
Where players once had brilliant vignettes that build towards climaxes, where they had to make choices like deciding between shooting their former comrade or letting him risk the lives of all other races by curing the Krogan of the disease that stopped them from conquering the galaxy in the first place. You now get to choose whether you're going to be a straight man or join in with the wise guys.
Liam! Hold me!
I'm sad I can't punch both of you.
There's nothing emotionally challenging either way, except you might be confused by Ryder's rapid mood swings.
Things were a little skin of our teeth, but we came out ahead.
We came this close to losing everyone. This close!
Unfortunately for Walters and for players, Walters couldn't keep his promise while also replacing the Paragon Renegade system with a system like this. It's not only a system that's integral to the Shepard character, it's a system that's integral to a Mass Effect game.
Think about it, Commander. The choice is yours.
It required a protagonist who could actually affect the world players were experiencing. And players would do this not by choosing each word for each line of dialogue for the character, or by deciding if they're angry towards a squad mate. Players affect the world with the essence of their identities, their morality. The missing moral choice that causes players to feel powerless to the whims of other characters making decisions on their behalf is made worse by the fact that players get one type of character, Ryder, a character who has few admirable traits no matter how much the players try to influence their personality. More often than not, Ryder makes it clear that he or she is an impotent,
Any thoughts, Ryder?
incompetent,
You're welcome here as an ally of the Angara.
I appreciate the warm welcome. It's a joke. To break the ice? Get it? Warm welcome? Ice?
doofus.
No, I mean, I think you're cute and I like seeing you up here. Oh my goodness, Ryder! Also, the accent. The accent is, I mean, it's not the only thing, but, okay, I should just go over there to the piloting thing.
Now, I don't know about you, but I found something really unsettling and creepy about the way Suvi looks. It's something about her bright red hair, bangs, blue eyes, and most revealingly her plastic face that seems strangely familiar.
God, to me, is an artist.
Probably just my imagination, though. But let's get back to this scene we're all familiar with. The writing is off here. There is no reason for Ryder to blather and stutter like a horned-up teenager asking out her first crush in middle school, when in actuality she's going on 30. It's weird. This awkward, clumsy, and inexperienced approach to the protagonist is one of Andromeda's weakest points, and Ryder was designed this way.
With this, I thought I'd really like us to close that gap as much as we can, without going full amnesia, doing something where my character is experiencing things for the first time at the same time I'm experiencing things for the first time. I just think that's a great story to tell, and Shepard is very much like a hero that became a legend. I wanted to sort of tell the story of someone who's just never really done this before, and they're kind of a fish out of water, and how do we do it, right?
There's nothing desirable in the Ryder characters. Both have these buffoonish attitudes where they seem incapable of demonstrating characteristics players want to demonstrate themselves. I can only speak for myself here, but I can't see myself in a character like Ryder who's frequently a doormat. And his response to being steamrolled is how enthusiastic or unenthusiastic he is about it. Instead of playing as a protagonist who I was able to see as a loose extension of myself, or at the very least, my values, I simply saw Ryder as the character holding my gun. I realize what I'm talking about can probably be attributed to the rushed development schedule, and that explains why this character feels so anemic. But I'm not making this video to only beat up on Andromeda. I want to use it as an example of what not to do when designing a story where players expect to interact with it. There were good intentions behind this change, and what Walters was trying to accomplish was admirable, but it was also a bad decision that weakened the relationship players had with the main character. And for a game that was so good at presenting a protagonist that gave players something unique, it's a disappointment to see it so misunderstood in Andromeda. Unfortunately, Andromeda failing to deliver on a protagonist that offered players a rich experience when interacting with the story was only part of the reason for why it suffered, because another major variable in making Mass Effect's world feel so robust were the well thought out non-player characters who populated the world. And as we're going to see, Andromeda didn't satisfy this obligation either. Again, Mac Walters was aware of their importance.
Characters, character moments, it's the characters that people remember. We can make amazing characters.
But the writers didn't quite stick the landing on this, because the NPCs in this game ranged from underwhelming to completely forgettable. Part of this has to do with the voice acting. Some of this acting should have been known on its face to not make it into the final cut.
A remnant the size of a building.
What? At least you made it and kept that thing away from the outpost. Nice work.
How much is it?
It'll be $18.
Here you go. Keep the change. Hi, doggy.
You're my favorite customer.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
But this was only a small part of why the characters weren't up to snuff. In the original trilogy, the NPCs were the essential tool for exposition. Just think about how much you learned about Mass Effect's world through these conversations, where you stood 4 feet apart from another alien or a spacefaring human. This was done to achieve a goal. The reason BioWare wanted players to learn about its story through fully voiced characters for each line of dialogue was because characters added that extra element of depth to the overall story. Depth that translates to showing and not telling. That barely noticed element of stories that, once you do notice, you realize just how important they are to the experience. It's why most horror movies open with a scene with a random person being killed, so we can see, maybe not the monster, but at least how it does the deed. Jaws didn't open with a scene of a news report talking about a shark attack. It opens with this. It's a way to make the audience empathize with the characters. Maybe not for this character, but certainly for this character when it happens to him. Now I realize it sounds like I'm saying Mass Effect showed and didn't tell in conversations with NPCs who were literally telling you things through hours of dialogue, and I want to be the first to say, that's exactly what I'm saying. That's because showing and not telling doesn't mean writers can never use characters to provide exposition, but rather, if a character provides exposition, writers can use that as an opportunity to show players how that exposition affects those characters personally. This is what Mass Effect was careful to accomplish in their conversations. Almost all of them contained a smaller story that showed players how the larger politics of the world trickled down all the way to the NPCs. This is what Mass Effect was careful to accomplish in their conversations, and I think it's most easily demonstrated in this conversation with the Volus and Elcor ambassadors. In this conversation, we don't just understand that the Elcor and Volus are two different aliens that make up the intergalactic government, we gain an understanding of the Volus' hostility towards humanity because they perceive us to receive special treatment.
All species must prove themselves before they join the Council. All but the Earth clans, it would seem.
Dismissive. Ignore the Volus ambassador, human. He is incorrect in his assessment.
He goes on to make more generalizations.
Why do you explain what you're about to say?
Our people communicate less through words and more through scent and slight movements. Plainly, we discovered our vocal expression was not enough to convey the feelings of our conversations to other species.
Why do you bother, Kalen? These Earth clan don't really care about our ways.
This is the worst kind of discrimination. The kind against me.
The reason he interrupts to talk about us as if we're not in the room isn't to just add flavor or tell a joke. The emotion of the NPCs show us how their perspective of the world influences their behavior. And their behavior gives us information about the story. Think about how much other information is being conveyed here. Even though humans are the newest race of the Citadel, we're not a fish out of water. We're actually advancing human interests. And we're not being assured of this by a race that would want us to think this, or else risk humanity being resentful of our lack of power. We know this because we're experiencing his hostility towards us. So while this isn't quite showing and not telling, it is showing as well as telling. These emotional responses tell a small story and a larger story that have their own rising actions and climaxes. If I were a pretentious windbag, I'd call these stories some stupid sounding buzzword like micro-narratives. So these micro-narratives are present in almost all the NPCs, and we're going to talk about those with the squad mates in Mass Effect 2 later, but for now, let's focus on the conversations that almost always happen when discovering a new area for the first time, and always seem to, like with the Elcor and Volus, happen when meeting a pair of NPCs. It happens when we get to Ferris and we learn just how unprepared the employees of the corporation they work for are when it comes to the Geth.
Commander, I'm glad they finally sent somebody to help us.
You're a bit late, aren't you?
Not just exposition.
What's Exogeny?
It's the company most of us worked for before the attacks. They fund this colony.
But the emotion too.
I wasn't trained for this. I didn't ask for it. I just wanted to end.
I get the feeling you don't like me.
How would you feel if you were hung out to dry by every government organization that ever promised to keep you safe? They should have sent a small fleet. Instead, we get one ship. And you're only interested in the Geth.
And we see it on Vermeer when we learn about the Genophage. Not just the background story.
We introduced the Genophage to the Krogan population after the uprising, to quell their numbers.
But the emotion, too.
Really? Saren created a cure for my people. You want to destroy it. Help me out here, Shepard. The lines between friend and foe are getting a little blurry from where I stand.
Sure, Mass Effect could have told us through an exposition dump just what the Genophage was, what it did to the Krogan, how the Krogan resent the rest of the galactic species, particularly the Solarians, for inventing it, and how the Krogan react to this. But they didn't. Instead, they allowed a Krogan to join your team, they gave players an opportunity to form a bond with him, and then when you were hearing about the information for the first time, you saw firsthand, probably with a character you cared about, just how volatile the subject was. Situations like the one with Rex serve as an example of Mass Effect doing this as well as they've ever done it. We don't just gain an insight into the history of the world, we gain an insight into how the different races perceive that history. This is what Mass Effect and Mass Effect 2 in particular excel at, micro-narratives through the eyes of the characters. Let's see what kind of micro-narrative we get from Andromeda.
Squinting stars, it's the Pathfinder. We heard about how you punched the cat. Punched them right in the exaltations. So amazing.
Shut up, Baniska. You're embarrassing.
You shut up. I'm being charming, right?
I'll wait over here while you two sort this out.
You see, Baniska? The Pathfinder agrees with me.
Yes, sure.
At least you tried. Where we once had a pair of NPCs that taught us about the world through their point of view, we now have a duo that begins the conversation by reflecting back at us things we already know.
We heard about how you punched the cat.
To the game's credit, they do go on to teach us a snippet of information about the world.
Those lights are conspicuous. Don't the cat attack?
We've adapted to that too. The cat wants to take us alive, so we fight to the death. It seems to deter them.
The problem with this is, there's absolutely no emotion. They say this to you lifelessly, like they're completely removed from the story. They could have come up with something to help us visualize this aspect of the story, which admittedly is pretty good so long as you're paying attention to it, and all they would have to do is tell us this piece of lore in a way that allowed us to experience it. They could have sent us on a mission where we were supposed to locate an Angara who was trying to complete a mission on their own, and we could have found their corpse somewhere in a Ket facility. It would allow us to have the option to ask the quest giver why the Angara didn't surrender. And in this discussion, we could have learned about the emotional burden of living in this war zone on Vold, where the expectation is that they sacrifice themselves so as to avoid exaltation. This is just an off-the-cuff example that doesn't tamper with any of the lore. It just takes advantage of environmental storytelling, and is a solution that actually shows you how the larger politics affect the individual characters. And in case I'm being too ambiguous about this, it shouldn't be delivered in a laid-back way.
We've adapted to that too.
It should be delivered in a somber way. The emotional disconnect between the NPCs and the game's story can be seen throughout your experience in Andromeda. In fact, the only character whose emotions I can reliably read are Suvi's, because she at least shows some passion.
You stupid bitch! You filthy slut! Did you fuck with me?
Even when we're trying to get an insight into the only friendly race we meet, and we're discussing an issue they should be passionate about, we get a lukewarm confession that sounds like he's saying this line at gunpoint.
You studied with Moshae Sefa. Is she a teacher or a religious figure?
She's many things. She's a clear thinker with deep knowledge and insight. She teaches and inspires. She's beloved. I love her.
It's a pretty important lore point, but there's no accompanying story as to why he loves her so that the audience can empathize with the Angara and see the world through their perspective. All we get is a vague assertion of how he describes their relationship. I would go on, but you get the idea. The game's filled with these flat characters who seem to be emotionally distanced from the events happening, and that makes the game's universe feel just as shallow and two-dimensional, because what Andromeda fails to carry over from its predecessors is the essential concept that there's something to be gained from demonstrating how the story impacts the humanity of the characters. So far we've seen how the game keeps its characters at arm's length from the background stories they've experienced and are experiencing. And we've also seen how it has the protagonist keep players at arm's length from their own stories. Now we're going to see how the game botches one of the most powerful mission categories in the game, the loyalty missions. These loyalty missions serve the same purpose as the conversations with the NPCs, but on steroids. Since the writers didn't have control over the main character like they do in other games, they used squad mates to act as the protagonist of their respective stories. And just like how audiences use empathy to take on the perspective of any protagonist, they would do the same thing here. So more than just exposition that helped players understand all the different points of view of the different races when describing the politics of the world, the loyalty missions gave players an intimate experience that helped them understand these things firsthand. These loyalty missions were thereby side stories where you learn about the specifics of what mattered to the representative characters, which would also teach you about the larger story of his or her race. So you have a story about the rite of passage that the Krogans experience at a certain age, even if that Krogan is made in a laboratory. You have a story that teaches us about the traditions and high crimes of the Quarians, who have learned from the mistakes of building the Geth. You have a story about the Geth and how some of them, like Legion, desire to work with organic life and are willing to reprogram and or kill their own kind in order to do what they think is right. And you have a story that teaches us about the thought process of the Solarian scientists who worked on the genophage and how he copes with the knowledge that he sentenced the species to extinction. All this information wasn't told to us through audio logs. It was something we actually experienced by interacting with the characters. We understand not only what's important to that specific crew member, but also what's important to the aliens we're going to need to work together with. This even extended to aliens we previously thought of as enemies, that we once thought it impossible to relate to, much less take on their perspective. It's a big deal that's not to be taken lightly. Mass Effect 2 used its characters to help flesh out the world so that we experienced something that we couldn't have otherwise experienced as a human. We saw the politics and priorities for each of these alien characters, and their cause then became our cause. Now, I know you think I'm going to say Andromeda got this wrong too, but I think it deserves some credit.
Hi, guys.
Nope. Never mind. Andromeda screws this up too. The prioritization of characters giving us individual vignettes that give us a much more personal understanding of the world, while essential to Mass Effect's story, are also ejected from Andromeda. Instead, what we're going to see can be described as banal and vacant homages to these loyalty missions that lost track of their original purpose. To be fair, Jaal's loyalty mission, and to a lesser extent Peebee's loyalty mission, attempt to reveal new information that's unique to this world through the eyes of these characters, and while I don't think they accomplished their goal, at least they tried. The rest of these stories don't have much to tell us about Andromeda's world, and instead use the world as the backdrop to offer light-hearted, goofy buddy cop adventures. We learn nothing new about the lore behind the races or conflicts of the world, just little things about the characters' personal lives, like they have a sister who bites off more than they can chew.
I didn't mean for any of this. I'm sorry, okay?
Or you learn about a squad mate who also bites off more than he can chew.
Well, something has to go right. You take a risk for the right reason. It's supposed to work.
Sure, we learn a bit about how there are opportunists taking advantage of the chaos in Andromeda, but beyond that, information is limited. In fact, if you do want to investigate how this mission is related to the larger politics of the world, trickling down to affect the individual character, Andromeda quickly reminds you of which game you're in because it seems to resent you asking those kinds of questions.
We'll need more than your assurances. Who's behind this? Why target settlers?
Ugh, does it matter? Are you gonna not save them if you don't like why they're in trouble?
Now it should be said that Andromeda clearly had a different mission statement when designing their loyalty missions. They wanted to have lighthearted, silly missions that aren't meant to be taken too seriously. There are good qualities to be found in these loyalty missions. I'm happy to admit they genuinely made me chuckle at times.
We just fixed those base seals. If you idiots blew them, I'll have your skins!
Everything's under control. Just a simple weapon malfunction. How are you?
Unfortunately, this approach doesn't have equal value to the brilliant loyalty missions that challenged our ethics and further engaged us in the story in the second game. And what's worse, the lack of seriousness isn't only present in the tone of the missions. There was a lack of seriousness in the writing that plagued these missions, with contradictions and insincere dialogue.
Liam? Hold me!
Rubbery faces aside, there's a real disconnect here from the events that are on screen and how the characters are reacting to it. At its worst, like in this moment, it starts to seem like the writers wrote the characters not from the perspective of the characters, but from the perspective of the writers. And that means the characters have knowledge of the script. In other words, it's obvious to the characters that they're in no real danger and they'll just have a good time by goofing off, even though there's every indication they're in a lot of danger. Oh yeah, I remember the last time we saw one of the characters get sucked out into space. It's funny! For some reason, Liam, Ryder, and your third squad mate seem to know they're about to be saved even though they have no indication that's going to happen. Normally, I would happily excuse this as just a joke and move on, but these things keep happening again and again, and it ends up being confusing because it contradicts the visual information made clear to the player. In Drax's mission, Vorn is an essential character to keep alive, but you might not know that because he jumps in front of a bullet to save Drax.
Watch out!
Normally, this would be a critical mission failure, but Vorn comes out of it just fine, without a scratch, much less a limp. Luckily, there wasn't any risk associated with that gesture. We see a similar situation in Jaw's loyalty mission when his brother Lathul is shot in the back.
It'll look like the initiative did it.
We have to disarm them.
The sister does the scream pose after she realizes what she's done, but Jaw doesn't seem very worried about his brother.
I hate Axul. Don't let him win.
You got it.
Instead, he leaves him for dead and offers Ryder this playful line.
I'm glad you're here.
But I guess they knew he was going to be fine without any indication of that, because he's up and walking again moments later. All it took to cure him was an apology.
I'm so sorry, Lathul.
And if you think these situations are limited to NPCs being written in a way where they have knowledge of what's going to happen next, it also extends to the player character's script. Later in that same mission, we confront Axul, who holds a gun to the face of Jal. The game then gives you another one of its QuickTime events, and you're given the opportunity to shoot Axul to save Jal. If you do pull the trigger, Jal will later lecture you about how you shouldn't have interfered.
Axul's death will strengthen the Roka's cause. I need to know, Ryder. Why didn't you trust me?
If you're like me, you'll be confused why he's telling you this considering the player's perspective. You just saved his life. Jal is drawing breath right now because of your intervention, but that's not how the game sees it. They want you to follow Jal's clairvoyant prediction.
If he shows up,
I know. Follow your lead.
Because even if you can't possibly know it, and even though the game does everything to indicate that Jal will be shot if you don't interfere, the game is telling players through Jal that he's in no real danger. Looking at the other outcome, we see why. Because if you don't shoot Axul to save Jal, Axul misses at point blank range and he only grazes Jal's cheek. Here's the most important factor in this situation. Axul did shoot Jal. Him holding a gun to the face of our ally wasn't an idle threat. He looked like he was going to shoot him. He did shoot him. But we should have known that his shot would miss. And it asks us to make the logical leap that Jal is doing this to turn the Rokar against Axul, even though we just saw another Angara shot by this group just before this, and no one seemed to really react except for Ryder and Jal. Instead of learning about the only friendly alien race in the game through the eyes of that race so that we're emotionally involved in their politics like in Mass Effect 2, Andromeda has us seeing the world through the eyes of the Ryder. Because the only reason players would take Jal's advice and be willing to ignore the gun pointed in his face is if they saw this.
If he shows up.
I know. Follow your lead.
Not as a request from the character, but instructions from the author. There was a real lack of sophistication with which these loyalty missions were written. Not only did it not achieve the same quality as the mission type it was named after, where players were more immersed in the world on the other end of these missions, it ended up alienating players from Andromeda. Because it makes players feel like they're not interacting with characters, but rather, it leaves them feeling like the characters are just there to dictate instructions from the writing team. Whether we're cued to crack a joke when players should feel like they're confronting death, or whether it be from listening to squad mates' instructions, even if that means players have to ignore all the visual information that's provided, causing them to resist that instinct to act as they would if they were in that situation themselves. This symptom of Andromeda's writing doesn't only disrupt the immersion, it demands players don't buy into the immersion, or else risk another moment like this one with Jal.
I need to know, Ryder. Why didn't you trust me?
A kind of punishment players receive for letting themselves get too wrapped up in the moment. And while it's at its worst in Jaws' mission, players will again see these moments where the player is just along for the ride while the writer uses NPCs not as living, breathing characters, but as a disposable catalyst to propel the next events. Whether it be writers using Sid as a hostage even though no harm will come to her no matter how you approach the scene, or the writers using PB's ex as someone who PB says she cares about,
I don't want her to die, Ryder! Put the device!
Unless you shoot her, in which case PB will forget about her pretty quick and immediately switch gears to save the remnant artifact. Not only did the writers not carry over the essence of the loyalty missions by getting players emotionally invested in the history and intergalactic politics that they as humans were entirely removed from, they reduced the characters to little more than decorations of the setting, just something to add a little more ambiance and context to the scene. There are few things as tragic as seeing something fail when it has the capacity to succeed, and that about sums up what happened with Andromeda's writing. They practically invented these tools to tell stories that didn't have players feeling like they were viewing from afar some foreign world's history. They made it feel like that history was so ubiquitous that it affected players personally. But because Andromeda neglected to retain the most important qualities of the games that preceded it, it did fail, and it failed hard. This all contributed to the major reason for why I can say with little reservation that Mac Walters did not keep his promise to fans.
And honestly, the best thing I can offer them is I just say, look, I'm not going to let this not feel like Mass Effect.
Thank you so much for watching. This first series of videos is a project I'm extremely excited to post because it's the first project that was funded by the very generous patrons that decided to support me. To all of you, thank you. I'd also like to thank Shane Levengood, Griffin116, Hans Homan, Kelly, Joshua Herman, Thomas Greenberg, KD, David Sternberg, Furious George, Grant Vogel, Rita Wallstrom, Ashley Dawkins, Max Mills, Jesse Sains, Simon Menzel, Ben Jones, and Abit Bakistan. To all of you who have supported me on Patreon, you have my sincere and eternal gratitude. Part 2 will be out very soon, and I don't mean that by sole porpoise standards, I actually mean that. Keep an eye out for that, and I'll see you guys next time.